Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Howdy everyone, and welcome back to Ask Rob and Rob, where you ask us questions and we give you answers. Same format every week, you kind of know it by now. And also the way you get involved is pretty easy too if you've listened to a few of these. But we'll remind you just in case.
Yeah, you should know this, but it's 013 808 00035. That's 013 808 00035. Leave us a voicemail or go over to thepropertyhub.net/ask. Leave us a message that way instead.
And that's exactly what Guy has done, and he's got a question about yields.
Hi Rob and Rob, this is Guy from Wakefield. I just wonder what you guys consider is a high yield for rent. I've got a few properties in Yorkshire and I'm getting about 5 or 6% yield. I'm in the market to buy another one or two, and I just wondered, is higher than 5 or 6% still achievable in today's climate, or what I should perhaps consider for my next purchase to get a higher yield? Any advice? Amazing. Cheers.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Not an uncommon question at all. Very hard for people to figure out what's achievable, I think. The first thing to do is to work out what we're talking about. So whenever anyone is talking to you about yield, make sure, first of all, you're both talking about the same thing. So what it sounds like is that Guy is talking about gross yield. So that is the annual rent divided by the purchase price. There's also net yield. There's also ROI. ROI really, as we've said before, is the all-important measure. That's the one that matters. But gross yield is a decent first filter for counting a property in or out, seeing if it merits further investigation. So now I've set it up, I'm going to hand over to you for the tricky part, Rob. Is 5 or 6% still achievable? Could Guy do even better? What do you think?
He could do better and he could do worse. It depends on where he's investing. Yes, you can absolutely get a better yield than 5 to 6%, but is it a better area? The thing is, Guy, where you live, you've probably seen yields diminish. You know, you had a higher yield a few years ago and now it's less. But what you've probably had, and the cause of that, is capital growth. So your area's capital values have improved. And actually, if you probably look at the numbers, you've probably made more from that growth than you have the yield. But it doesn't mean you have to accept that yield. You can do and carry on investing, and you may get more of that growth, which is ace. Or you may look to other areas where that growth hasn't kicked in yet and get that sort of yield that you're after. Now, you have to be careful you don't chase yield too hard, because this is what happens as the market heats up. And we are not far away, I feel, from a boom in the Midlands and the North. Because what will happen is property prices will increase and therefore yields will reduce. And people will still chase yield. And they'll chase them into areas they may not normally have ventured into a few years ago. So areas that aren't as nice is probably the best way of putting it. But you have to be careful, because those areas eventually will get capital growth after everywhere else has had it, but they tend to fall harder as well in any crash. So be careful of how far you chase yield. You might have to accept that you might make 1% or 2% less, but be comforted by that you're going to get some capital growth instead. And actually, 1% here or there, is it life-changing? I'd suggest not. So I'd focus on fundamentals first, as long as it's a semi-acceptable yield, and go from it that point of view. But of course, it depends on your strategy, whether you're in for this for the long term or you need a short-term income now. There's so many variables. But like I started with this answer, can you get that yield? Yes. Can you do better? Yes. Can you do worse? Yes. It just depends on what's most important to you right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Guy said, is there anything I should consider for my next purchase to get a higher yield? And of course, everyone would rather have a higher yield than a lower yield. But if high yield is the most important thing to you, then you should probably be looking at specifically high yielding investments, things like HMOs. Whereas if it's just a nice to have and you're actually looking at the best prospect over the long term, then what Rob has just said absolutely nails it. You need to be looking at the full picture. And the headline gross yield, 1-2% either way, probably isn't going to be make or break for the investment. So lots to think about.
Right. Next up is Caroline.
Hi Rob and Rob, it's Caroline here in the Highlands. I was wondering what your thoughts were on buying properties of non-standard construction, particularly prefabs. I'm getting to the end of my first renovate to holiday let project and I'm looking for the next. I found a 1960s prefab that's been blocked around. It has views to die for. It's right on the beach, so it ticks a lot of boxes. I know I won't be able to get a mortgage on it, but are there any other issues that I need to be aware of? Particularly since I'd want to change the internal layout, which is currently 6 beds and 1 bath. Thanks a lot. Love the show, and you've kept me going through an awful lot of plastering and decorating over the last 6 months.
Okay, Caroline, thank you for your question. So you've managed to identify the main issue with prefabs, which is mortgages. So you've said that you won't be able to get a mortgage on it. You're okay with that. The main thing that I would say, Rob, is that Caroline might not want a mortgage, and that's fine, but thinking ahead to the exit, her future buyer might do, so her exit options might be a bit limited.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the main thing. The reason why lenders don't lend on them is because they weren't built to last. Now, you may disagree, and you may say, well, actually, it's lasted far beyond the time it was meant to, which many of the prefabs you find were built, say, around the Second World War, and were built for 20, 30 years and are still standing perfectly well today. But mortgageability is limited. But that exit is really important for most people. And if you plan on never selling and passing it down through generations and they'll never sell, then fine. But you have to take that into account. Also, what's the motivation for doing prefabs? Is it a love of prefab buildings? I'd suggest that's pretty niche, so I'm going to say no. So you're probably attracted by the yield. But there are other ways of getting high yield. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I think what we would say is have a look at other options first where you can get finance, because it is really important for your exit. So possibly be open to look at HMOs if you're chasing yield, or high yielding areas. So there are areas of the UK that you can still get a really, really good yield. Not an area you necessarily want to move into, but an area that you could definitely get a really, really attractive yield. So pros and cons. Pros, yield, but you can get that elsewhere. Cons, mortgageability. So overall, I'm not saying don't do it, but just go in eyes wide open, and now hopefully you can make an informed decision.
So there you go, another couple of property questions dispatched. If you've got something rattling around in your head and you want to know the answer, then you can follow in the footsteps of Paul and Caroline and get yourself on the podcast. Just go along to thepropertyhub.net/ask. We would love to hear your question. We'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob next week. And of course, we have the property podcast on Thursday. So we look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.